The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the ship itself was clearing its throat before it screamed. I was halfway through a ration bar when the lights on the Calder station dropped to amber. Around me, 3 different alien crew members stopped moving at the exact same moment, like someone had pulled a plug. A Volant trader named Os flattened his ear stalks against his skull. A Dravoxy engineer named Finn dropped a tool and did not pick it up. I kept chewing. "Derek," Os said, voice tight, "why are you not reacting?" "Because it's a docking bay decompression warning, not a hull breach," I said. "Bay 4. Somebody probably forced a seal without waiting for the green light again." Finn stared at me like I had grown a second head. "How do you know this from a tone?" "Because I've heard it 9 times this month." The amber light cut to red. Somewhere down the corridor, a voice that was not human shouted something sharp and panicked in a language my translator didn't catch fast enough. I set my ration bar down, stood up, and walked toward Bay 4 at a pace that made both of them practically vibrate with confusion. "You're not running," Os said, following anyway. "It's not that kind of alarm." "How do you know what kind of alarm it is?" "Practice." We reached the bay door. Through the reinforced window, I could see a cargo loader pinned under a shifted crate, his lower legs trapped, his breathing mask cracked at the seal. 2 Volant dock workers stood frozen near the control panel, arguing over which lever released the pressure clamp instead of which lever released the crate. I keyed the override, the door hissed open, and I crossed the bay in 11 steps. I did not run. Running on a deck with a partial gravity fault was how you ended up as the second person trapped under a crate. I crouched, found the manual release pin, and pulled it. The crate lifted on its hinge a half meter. Enough. The loader, a young Dravoxy named Tech, dragged himself free, coughing through the cracked seal of his mask. I pressed my palm against the crack to slow the leak and shouted for the dock workers to bring the kit. They moved like they'd forgotten their own legs existed until I shouted again, sharper this time. Within 4 minutes, Tech had a new mask. His vitals were stable, and the crate was secured. I stood up, wiped my hands on my jumpsuit, and turned to find half the bay staring at me. "What?" I said. Os approached slowly, like I might still be dangerous. "You walked into an emergency." It was a contained emergency. Running would have meant somebody else got hurt slipping on the deck plating. "You did not raise your voice until the workers failed to move. They needed it." "You are not even breathing hard." I looked down at myself. He was right, but only because I'd done this kind of thing more times than I could count back home, long before any of us had a ship, a station, or alien crewmates who flinched when a human walked too calmly into danger. "I don't understand the question you're trying to ask me," I said. "The question," Finn said, arriving behind Os with his toolkit still in hand, "is why your species treats catastrophe like a chore." I almost laughed. "It's not a chore. It's just not the end of the world, unless I decide it is." Neither of them answered that. They exchanged a look, the kind of look that meant they were filing something away in a drawer marked human, "We'll examine later." I didn't think much of it. I'd seen that look 100 times since joining this station's mixed crew 8 months ago. Every species had their own threshold for fear, their own volume for panic, and apparently mine sat in a different register than theirs. I went back to finish my ration bar. It had gone cold, which was the only part of the whole event that genuinely annoyed me. 3 days later, I learned that not all my crewmates filed that moment away quietly. I was in the common mess hall when a Volant I didn't recognize sat across from me without asking. She had pale gold markings along her jaw, sharp eyes, and the posture of someone used to being listened to. "You're Derek," she said. "The one from Bay 4. "That's me. I'm Elira. I run cargo logistics on Deck 2. She set down a tablet between us, screen dark. "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, not a polite one." "Go ahead." "Is it true that humans can be calm through almost anything, but there's a point where the calm just stops?" I considered the question longer than she expected, I think, because she leaned back slightly when I didn't answer right away. "Yes," I said finally, "that's true." "What happens at that point?" "I don't know how to explain it to someone who hasn't seen it." "Try." I thought about Tech's mask cracking, about the crate, about every smaller incident before that one, stacked up over months. None of them had been the point. They were just weather. It's not really anger, I said. It's more like running out of road. You keep driving, keep adjusting, keep absorbing whatever's thrown at you, and then one day, there's no more road left, and you say so. Say so how? You'll know it when you hear it. Alira's jaw tightened, just slightly, in a way I was starting to recognize as the universal alien expression for, "That's not an answer, and I don't like it." "There's a story going around the outer routes," she said, "about a human transport captain near the Calder Reach, some kind of incident with raiders. Nobody who tells it agrees on the details, but everyone agrees on one part. The human said something short, 4 words, and then everything got very quiet, and then everything got very bad for the raiders." "I haven't heard that one." "You're sure?" "I'm sure. But I believe it." She studied me like I was a puzzle with one piece missing, and the missing piece was somehow the only piece that mattered. "Why do you believe it without knowing the details?" "Because I know what it feels like right before I'd say something like that myself. And I've never had a reason to find out what comes after." Elira picked her tablet back up, lit the screen, and didn't look at it. "I hope you never do," she said, and there was something almost gentle in it, buried under all that sharp posture. "For your sake, not for ours." "Why not for yours?" She didn't answer that one either. She just stood, nodded once like she was filing the conversation away in the same drawer Oss and Finn had used, and walked off toward the cargo lifts. I sat there a while longer, turning her words over. "For your sake, not for ours." As if whatever happened on the other side of that line cost the human more than anyone else in the room. I didn't think about it again for almost 2 weeks, which in hindsight was exactly long enough for the universe to start setting things up. It started small, the way these things always do. A supply shortage on Deck 6 that nobody could explain. A docking fee dispute that escalated past where docking fee disputes had any business escalating. A trade envoy from a species I'd never worked with before, the Corvith, arriving on station with a manner that set every hair on the back of my neck on edge before they'd said a single word. I was assigned to liaison duty for their visit, mostly because the station's diplomatic officer was out on medical leave and I was the only one with both the security clearance and the patience to sit through what everyone assumed would be a tedious trade negotiation. Tedious wasn't the word I would have chosen by the end of the first hour. The Corvith delegation leader, a broad-shouldered being named Vask, had a habit of testing people before he negotiated with them. He arrived 20 minutes late without apology. He interrupted Ilira, who was present for the cargo logistics portion, twice in the first 10 minutes, cutting her off mid-sentence both times. He addressed me only when he wanted something, and otherwise spoke as though I were furniture that happened to be useful. I let it go. All of it. Lateness wasn't a crime. Interruptions weren't a crime. Treating me like furniture wasn't pleasant, but it also wasn't my problem to fix in someone else's species during a single meeting. Then Vask said something about Elira's competence, in front of her, in a tone that made the translator render it as a question mark, even though it was structured as a statement, and I watched her spine go rigid in a way I recognized from the mess hall conversation. The posture of someone absorbing something they didn't want to absorb, because the room required it of them. I still let it go. It wasn't my fight, not yet, and Elira was more than capable of handling herself. It was the cargo manifest that finally cracked something open. Vask's delegation had requested priority docking for a shipment that, according to every scan we ran, did not match its declared contents. I flagged it through proper channels, quietly, the way protocol demanded. Vask found out within the hour, which meant someone on station had told him, which was its own problem for another day. He found me in the corridor outside the negotiation room. No Elira this time. No witnesses, as far as he seemed to think. "You flagged my shipment," he said. "Standard procedure for a manifest discrepancy. You flagged it because you don't trust my species. I flagged it because the numbers didn't match. That's all it is." He stepped closer, close enough that the gesture itself was the message, regardless of what came out of his mouth next. "On my world," he said, "small creatures like you Learn quickly not to interfere with things they don't understand. I didn't move. I'd been called small by beings twice my size before, and it had never once made me smaller. I understand manifests, I said. That's the part of this I'm interfering with. You should be more careful. I am being careful. Careful is exactly what flagging a discrepancy looks like. Something shifted in his posture. A kind of testing pressure, like he was pushing against a door to see if it was locked. Careful, he repeated, almost mocking. Your species talks about careful, while it lectures species who have existed for 10 times as long as yours. I'm not lecturing anyone. I'm doing my job. Your job, he said, is whatever I decide it is, while my cargo sits on your station. I felt something settle in my chest. Not heat exactly, more like a stillness. The kind of stillness that comes right before weather changes, the air going quiet before wind. I recognized it the way you recognize a familiar room in the dark, by shape rather than sight. Your cargo will clear inspection, I said, or it won't dock. Those are the only two outcomes available to you right now. Vask's mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. And if I decide otherwise? I looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that whatever he saw in my face made the curl of his mouth falter, just slightly, just enough that I noticed. You won't, I said. Not today. He left without another word, which told me more than anything he could have said. I stood alone in the corridor for a moment, feeling that stillness in my chest slowly fade back into its usual shape, and thought about Alira's question from 2 weeks earlier. What happens at that point? I still didn't have an answer. But for the first time I could feel the road getting shorter under my feet, and I didn't like how far I could suddenly see down it. The cargo inspection happened the next morning, and it confirmed what the manifest discrepancy had already suggested. Vask's shipment contained restricted components, the kind used to bypass docking authentication systems, hidden under a layer of declared agricultural goods. Station security took the crates into custody. Vask was summoned to the administrator's office. I wasn't required to attend that meeting, but Ilira found me afterward in the observation deck above the main concourse, where I sometimes went to watch the traffic of ships easing in and out of the station's gravity well. He's furious, she said, joining me at the rail. Not at security. At you. Why me specifically? Because you're the one who flagged it before anyone else even looked twice. He thinks you targeted him. I targeted a manifest. He happened to be attached to it. That distinction won't matter to him. She folded her arms, watching a freighter dock 3 berths down. Vask isn't just a trade delegate, Derek. He's the youngest son of a Corveth war clan. His station here is partly about trade, and partly about proving himself capable of something his older siblings already accomplished. Getting caught smuggling restricted components isn't just an embarrassment. It's a humiliation he can't easily undo. That's not a reason to smuggle restricted components in the first place. No, but it's a reason he might not let this go quietly. I turned that over for a moment. What does not letting it go quietly look like? With his species? Ilira hesitated, which told me the answer wasn't simple. Corveth clans settle humiliation through demonstration. He'll want to prove that the thing which embarrassed him was insignificant. That you were insignificant. It's not really about the cargo anymore. It's about restoring the size of his name in front of people who matter to him. So he's going to do something stupid to feel less small. In Corveth terms, yes, though they wouldn't put it that way. I thought about the corridor, his voice telling me that small creatures should learn not to interfere, and felt that same stillness from before settle briefly in my chest before passing. I'm not worried about him, I said. You should be a little worried. Not for your safety, for what happens around you if this escalates. She turned to look at me directly. I asked you once what happens when a human runs out of road. I think I'm starting to understand that I don't actually want to find out, but I have a feeling I might anyway. It hasn't gotten anywhere close to that, I said. He's angry and embarrassed. That's not the same as dangerous. With most species, no. With a Corveth war clan son trying to save face, those two things tend to become the same thing very quickly. She left it there, and I let her, because there wasn't anything productive to add. I went back to my quarters that night, turning the conversation over, weighing how much of it was genuine caution and how much was Elira's own anxiety bleeding through her usual sharp composure. I didn't yet understand how right she'd been to worry. The first sign came 2 days later, in the form of a formal complaint filed against me through station administration. Vask claimed I had fabricated the manifest discrepancy as a personal vendetta against his species, a deliberate insult timed to embarrass his delegation in front of trade partners. It was a transparent lie, the kind that wouldn't survive 5 minutes of scrutiny against the actual scan data, and the administrator dismissed it within a day. But the filing wasn't really meant to succeed. It was meant to put my name into a system, to create a paper trail that made me look like the aggressor rather than the person who'd simply done his job. I should have recognized that as the opening move it was. Instead, I treated it as a closed matter and went back to my regular duties, which included a stretch of routine maintenance contracts, supply audits, and the kind of unglamorous work that actually keeps a station running. I didn't think about Vask again for almost a week, and when I did, it was only because Finn mentioned, almost in passing, that the Corvith delegation hadn't left the station yet, despite their trade business having technically concluded. "They're still here?" I asked, looking up from the conduit panel I was repairing in the lower maintenance corridor. "Docked at berth 11, 3 days now, past their scheduled departure." Finn handed me a replacement coupling without being asked, which had become something of a habit between us since the Bay 4 incident. Elira mentioned it to me. She seemed concerned. Did she say why they're staying? No official reason given to the station. Unofficially, dock workers say Vask has been making inquiries about station personnel, schedules, quarters assignments. I set the coupling down slowly. Whose schedules? Finn didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. Mine, I said. That is the assumption, yes. I finished the repair in silence, turning the information over with the same careful attention I'd give to a system fault that hadn't yet revealed its full scope. A delegate humiliated by his own smuggling attempt, lingering past departure, asking about my schedule. None of that pointed toward a productive resolution. I reported it to station security that afternoon, more out of procedural diligence than genuine alarm. The security chief, a clipped and efficient woman named Priya, listened to the full account and frowned in the particular way that meant she was already 3 steps ahead of me in her thinking. "We've had eyes on his delegation since the manifest incident," she said. "Standard practice after a smuggling attempt. I'll increase the watch around your quarters and your usual routes, but I want to be straightforward with you, Derek. We can't hold him on suspicion alone. Inquiring about a station employee's schedule isn't illegal, just concerning. Understood. I'd also recommend you avoid being alone with him under any circumstances, formal or otherwise. If he approaches you, document it and report it immediately. Don't engage beyond what's necessary." I haven't been looking to engage with him at all. I know. That's exactly why I'm telling you this now, before it becomes necessary advice instead of precautionary advice. She held my gaze for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. "You have a reputation already, you know. Even before this. People talk about how calm you stay under pressure. I want you to understand that calm isn't the same as safe. Don't let his behavior convince you that staying calm means nothing bad can happen. I appreciated the warning, even if I privately thought it was unnecessary. I'd dealt with difficult people before, in difficult circumstances, long before this station or this crew. Vask's wounded pride didn't strike me as anything beyond an irritation that would eventually exhaust itself. I was wrong about that, though the wrongness took its time revealing itself. Over the following week, small things began happening around me, each one minor enough to dismiss individually, but accumulating into a pattern I couldn't ignore once I started paying attention. A maintenance request I'd filed got mysteriously reassigned to a different technician, delaying a repair I'd flagged as urgent. My quarters access code stopped working for an entire morning, requiring an emergency override from station security to get back in. A scheduling conflict appeared on my work calendar that I hadn't created and couldn't trace to any legitimate source. None of it was dramatic. All of it was deniable. And all of it had the unmistakable fingerprint of someone testing boundaries, probing for a reaction, the way a hand might press lightly against a locked door just to feel whether the hinges had any give. I didn't give him the reaction. I filed reports for each incident, kept my responses purely procedural, and continued my work without visible disruption. If Vask was watching for cracks, I made sure he saw none. Illyra noticed anyway. She'd taken to checking in with me more frequently, ostensibly about cargo logistics, though the conversations usually drifted towards something more personal within the first few minutes. "You haven't reacted to any of it," she said one evening, finding me in the mess hall again, this time sliding into the seat across from me without the formality of her first approach weeks earlier. "The access code, the maintenance request, all of it, you've just absorbed it. Reacting is what he wants. I'm not giving it to him. That's a very controlled way to live. It's not difficult, it's just patience. Is there a limit to it?" I thought about that question longer than I expected to. "Yes," I said. "But I don't think about where that limit is until I'm standing right next to it. Thinking about it too early just makes the waiting harder." Illyra studied me with that same careful attention she'd shown weeks before, the look of someone trying to map unfamiliar terrain by feel rather than sight. "I keep hearing that story about the transport captain," she said, "the one near Calder Reach. I looked into it further, actually, found someone who claimed to have witnessed it secondhand. And they said the captain absorbed nearly 2 hours of escalating threats from the raiders before saying anything at all. 2 hours of insults, demands, even a mock execution of one of the captain's crew members staged just to provoke a response. The captain stayed completely silent through all of it, gave no reaction, and then, very quietly, said 4 words, and the entire tone of the situation changed so fast that the person telling me the story still couldn't fully describe what happened next, only that the raiders who survived never approached a human vessel again. I didn't say anything for a while. Outside the viewport behind her, a shuttle eased into its berth, running lights blinking in steady rhythm. 2 hours, I finally said. That's a long road. Is that normal? For your species? It's not abnormal. Some people have shorter roads, some have longer ones. It depends on what they're protecting and how much they've already lost protecting it before. What's your road like? I met her eyes, and for the first time since this conversation began weeks ago, I let myself actually consider the question instead of deflecting it. I don't know yet, I admitted. I haven't needed to find out. She didn't respond right away, and in the quiet that followed, I became aware of just how much had shifted since that first conversation, in this same mess hall. Back then, this had felt like an abstract curiosity, a piece of alien folklore about an alien species she didn't understand. Now it felt like she was watching a fuse burn, slow and patient, towards something she couldn't yet name but had already learned to fear. The next development came 3 days later, and it didn't leave room for ambiguity the way the earlier incidents had. I was reviewing supply logs in the lower maintenance office when Tech, the young Dravoxy loader I'd pulled from under the crate weeks earlier, appeared in the doorway looking pale beneath his mottled skin tone, breathing fast in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "Derek," he said, voice unsteady, "you need to come to berth 11. "What's happened?" "It's Illyra. Vask's people. She's..." He struggled to find words, his translator lagging behind his evident distress. "They have her. In the cargo bay near his ship. Security is already moving, but they said it could take time to clear it legally. Something about diplomatic boundaries on his docked vessel." Something in my chest went very still, very quickly, the kind of stillness that doesn't feel calm so much as it feels like the moment right before a held breath finally has to release. "How long has this been happening?" I asked, already moving toward the door. "Maybe 10 minutes. She went to confirm a manifest detail with his crew. She hasn't come back. One of the dock workers saw them pull her into the bay and seal the hatch behind her." I didn't run. Not yet. I walked fast, the same controlled pace I'd used crossing bay 4 months earlier, because panic on a deck with uneven traffic only created new problems, and I needed every advantage I could keep intact. But something in the rhythm of my own footsteps had changed, a tightness threading through each step that hadn't been there in any of the smaller incidents before this one. Tech struggled to keep pace beside me. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." "Derek, Vask is dangerous. His own delegation has been afraid of him since the manifest incident. If he's escalated to this, he won't stop because someone asks him politely. I'm not planning on asking him politely. We reached the corridor leading to berth 11, where two station security officers stood near a sealed hatch, weapons holstered but hands resting near them, clearly waiting on clearance that hadn't yet arrived. Priya was there too, speaking rapidly into a comm unit, frustration evident in the set of her shoulders. "Derek," she said, lowering the comm when she saw me, "I need you to stay back. We're working the diplomatic angle to get clearance to breach without triggering an incident that... How long will that take?" "I don't know. Minutes, possibly longer. These things have protocols for a reason, and breaking them wrong could... Illyra doesn't have minutes to spare if he's already decided what he wants to do with her." Priya's expression tightened. "I understand the urgency. I do. But charging in without clearance turns this into an interspecies incident that could... I wasn't listening anymore. Not entirely. I was looking at the sealed hatch, at the faint hum of its locking mechanism, at the small maintenance panel beside it that I recognized from my own repair work weeks earlier, the kind of access point that existed for exactly this sort of situation, regardless of what diplomatic protocol preferred. Something inside me had finally run out of road. It didn't feel like anger, not the way I'd always imagined anger might feel. It felt clearer than that, quieter, like every unnecessary thought had been stripped away, leaving only the shape of what needed to happen next. "Derek," Priya said again, more firmly, sensing the shift in me before I'd said a single word. "Whatever you're thinking, don't." I looked at her, and something in my face must have changed, because she actually took a half step back. "I'm done waiting," I said. The words came out quiet, almost gentle, in a strange way, the way a door closing gently can still mean something has ended completely. Tech went very still beside me. One of the security officer's hands drifted fully onto his weapon, not aimed at me, just present, like he suddenly understood he was standing closer to something volatile than he'd realized a moment ago. I crouched at the maintenance panel, and my hands moved with a steadiness that surprised even me, given what I could feel building beneath that steadiness, contained, but no longer waiting to be released. The maintenance panel released with a soft click, the same sound it made every time I'd serviced it before, ordinary and unremarkable, except now it was the only thing standing between me and whatever was happening on the other side of that hatch. I found the manual bypass, the one built into every berth door for emergency depressurization scenarios, and triggered it before Priya could finish whatever sentence she'd started. The hatch hissed and slid open just enough for a person to pass through sideways. "Derek, wait for backup," Priya said, but she was already moving to follow rather than stop me, which told me everything about how much faith she actually had in protocol, resolving this in time. I slid through the gap first. The cargo bay beyond was dim, lit only by the amber glow of standby lighting along the floor seams. Crates lined both walls, some still bearing the markings of Vask's seized shipment, others new, brought aboard since the manifest incident. In the center of the open floor space, Illyra stood with her arms restrained behind her by two Corvette crew members, while Vask paced in front of her, speaking in a low, controlled voice that carried none of the bluster he'd used in the corridor with me weeks earlier. "You don't need to do this," Illyra was saying, her voice steady despite everything. "Whatever you think this accomplishes, it doesn't fix what you actually... It restores what your station took from me," Vask said. "A demonstration, a small one, nothing permanent, just enough that everyone remembers my name means something." I stepped fully into the bay, and the small scuff of my boot against the deck plating was enough to turn every head in the room. Vask's eyes found mine, and something in his expression flickered, surprise giving way almost immediately to something colder, more deliberate. "The human," he said, almost amused. "Of course, come to play the hero." "Let her go," I said. "Or what?" He gestured loosely at the two crew members holding her. "You're outnumbered, unarmed, and standing in my territory. This hatch was sealed for a reason." I noticed the seal didn't hold. His jaw tightened at that, the first genuine crack in his composure. You think this is a game. You think your station's rules protect you here. They don't. Nothing protects either of you here, except whatever I decide to allow. I didn't move closer, not yet. I kept my eyes on Alira instead, checking for injury, finding none yet, though the tension in her shoulders told me how close that yet had come to becoming something worse. "Alira," I said, keeping my voice level, "are you hurt?" "No," she said, "not yet." He's been talking more than acting, which I think means he's still deciding what kind of demonstration he actually wants to make. That's useful information. Vask's pacing stopped. "You're speaking to her like I'm not standing here." "I'm speaking to her because she answered my question." "You haven't answered mine." "What question?" "Whether you're going to let her go before this gets worse for you, or after." Something about the phrasing landed wrong with him. I could see it settle into his expression, the careful control slipping another fraction. "Worse for me," he repeated, and laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You're a single unarmed creature, standing in a cargo bay, surrounded by my crew, lecturing me about consequences." "I'm not lecturing. I'm informing." "Informing me of what, exactly?" I felt that stillness in my chest again, the same one from the corridor weeks earlier, except now it had grown into something larger, something that filled the space behind my ribs with a kind of pressure that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite anything I had a name for. 2 hours, Alira had said about the transport captain near Calder Reach. I didn't know how long my own road had been, only that I could feel myself standing at the very end of it now, looking out at nothing but open ground where the path used to be. "Let her go," I said again. "Right now." Vask's 2 crew members exchanged a glance, the kind that suggested even they were beginning to recalculate something about the situation, some instinct older than the chain of command they currently operated under. But Vask himself only smiled, slow and certain, the expression of someone who had decided his own narrative and intended to see it through regardless of what the room actually contained. "No," he said. I took 1 step forward. Behind me, I heard Priya enter through the gap in the hatch, followed by the 2 security officers, their weapons drawn now. The careful procedural caution from minutes ago, apparently abandoned the moment the situation had visibly escalated past whatever threshold their training allowed for hesitation. Tech crowded in behind them, wide-eyed, clearly torn between fear and the instinct to help. "Stand down," Priya said, her voice sharp, aimed at the Corvith crew rather than at me. "Release her immediately, and this can still end without further incident." Vask didn't even look at her. His attention stayed fixed on me, studying my face the way you might study a storm system on a sensor display, trying to determine whether the readings in front of you were accurate or some kind of malfunction. "You're very calm," he said, almost curious now, the bravado momentarily set aside in favor of genuine confusion. For someone watching their colleague threatened, most species by this point would be shouting, pleading, something. "I'm not most species. Clearly." He tilted his head slightly. "What are you then?" I held his gaze, and the words that came out of me arrived quiet, almost conversational, the way you might mention the weather to someone who hadn't yet noticed the sky had changed color. "I'm someone who's been very patient with you," I said. "For a long time now. Through the corridor, through the complaint you filed, through every small thing your people did to my schedule, my quarters, my work, hoping I'd react and give you a reason to call me dangerous. I didn't react to any of it, because none of it was worth the road it would have cost me to react." Vask's smile faltered slightly. "But this," I continued, my voice not rising, not sharpening, simply settling into something colder and more final than anything I'd said before. "This is the end of that road. There's nothing left past this point. Now I'm actually getting annoyed." The bay went silent. I watched it happen in real time, the way the words landed not just on Vask, but on everyone around him, his own crew members included. The 2 holding Alira's arms loosened their grip, just slightly, an instinctive recoil that neither of them seemed to consciously choose. Priya, beside me, went very still, her weapon lowering a fraction as though some part of her recognized that whatever happened next was no longer within the boundaries her training had prepared her for. Even Tech, behind us, made a small sound, something between a gasp and a held breath. Vask alone didn't seem to grasp the shift immediately, still riding the momentum of his own narrative. "You think 4 words change anything," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "You're still unarmed, still outnumbered. Nothing about this situation has actually—" I crossed the distance between us before he finished the sentence. I won't describe every detail of what happened in the next several seconds, because describing it accurately would require dwelling on things I'd rather not relive in that much clarity, even now. What I can say is that the 2 crew members holding Elira released her entirely the moment I moved, stepping back rather than intervening, some instinct overriding whatever orders Vask had given them. What I can say is that Vask, for all his earlier bravado, found himself reassessing his own confidence within the first half-second of actual contact, and that reassessment came far too late to matter. What I can say is that it was over quickly, far more quickly than 2 hours. Far more quickly than I expected, given how long the road leading to it had felt. When it ended, Vask was on the ground, not seriously harmed but thoroughly, undeniably reminded that whatever he'd believed about the limits of small creatures had been catastrophically incomplete. I stood over him, breathing controlled, hands steady, the pressure behind my ribs already beginning to recede now that it had finally been allowed somewhere to go. Priya moved past me to secure him, her security officers fanning out to restrain the remaining Corvith crew, who offered no resistance whatsoever, their earlier confidence having evaporated entirely in the space of a few seconds. I turned to Elira. "Are you hurt?" I asked again, and this time my voice had returned almost completely to its usual register, the storm having passed through and left something quieter in its wake. "No," she said, staring at me with an expression I couldn't entirely place, something between relief and a kind of awe that made me faintly uncomfortable. "No, I'm fine. Derek, what you just—" "I know. You said 4 words and the entire room changed before you even moved." "I know that too." She glanced past me at Vask, now being hauled upright by Priya's officers, his expression dazed, his earlier certainty replaced by something that looked uncomfortably close to genuine fear. "That's the story," she said quietly. "Isn't it? The transport captain near Calder Reach. This is what that actually looks like. I don't know what that looked like. I only know what this looked like. It looked like the end of the world arriving very quietly and leaving very fast." I didn't have an answer for that. I looked down at my own hands, steady now, though they hadn't felt steady in the moment itself, and tried to reconcile the stillness I felt now with the pressure that had filled my chest only minutes earlier. It felt like waking up from something, not quite a dream, more like surfacing from water I hadn't realized I'd been underneath. Priya approached, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who had a great deal to process and very little time to process it in. "We'll need a full statement from you," she said. "Both of you. And Derek, I need to ask, are you hurt anywhere?" "No." "Good." She paused, glancing back at Vask, then at me again. "For what it's worth, that de-escalated faster than anything I've handled in this job. I've never seen a hostage situation end with 4 words and under 10 seconds of actual contact. It wasn't really about the 4 words," I said. "It was about everything before them." "What do you mean?" I looked at Elira, then at Tech, still hovering near the hatch with wide eyes, then at the security officers securing the last of Vask's crew, all of them watching me now with the same expression Oss and Finn had worn back in Bay 4, months ago, when I'd first started noticing how differently my species seemed to register on their internal scales of caution. "I mean that the 4 words were just the last step," I said. "Everything before them was the actual distance, the road, and once you've walked all of it, the last step doesn't take very long at all." Nobody in the bay said anything else for a long moment. Outside the hatch, I could hear the ordinary sounds of the station continuing, other crews going about other tasks, entirely unaware that something had just happened in Berth 11 that would, by tomorrow, already be reshaping into rumor and then into something closer to legend, the way these things always seem to. I helped Elira to her feet, checked once more that she was steady, and started toward the hatch, but Priya's voice stopped me before I reached it. "Derek, Hold a moment. I turned. She was crouched beside Vask, who sat slumped against a crate, one of her officers running a medical scanner over him, while another kept a weapon trained loosely in his direction. Vask's eyes tracked me as I approached, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something in them that wasn't bravado or contempt. It was closer to the look Tech had given the cracked seal on his mask weeks earlier, the look of someone reassessing how close they'd actually come to something they hadn't fully understood. "He wants to say something," Priya said, her tone carefully flat, neither encouraging nor forbidding it. I waited. Vask's jaw worked for a moment before words came. "I miscalculated," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him more than the bruising had. "I thought your species' patience was a kind of weakness, something to be tested until it broke into nothing." "It's not weakness," I said. "It's just patience. Weakness and patience aren't the same thing, even if they can look similar from the outside for a while." "I see that now." He glanced down at his own hands, then back up at me. "Is this how it always ends? When your people reach that point?" I thought about the question honestly before answering, because it deserved that much. "I don't know how it always ends," I said. "I only know how this one did. Other people might have a different road, a different ending. I can't speak for all of us. But the warning is the same." "The warning is always the same," I said, "because by the time you hear it, the road's already been walked. The words aren't a threat. They're just the last marker before the end of it." Vask had nothing to say to that. Priya's officer finished the scan, confirmed no serious injuries beyond bruising, and helped him to his feet to be escorted out under guard. As they led him past me toward the hatch, he paused, just briefly, meeting my eyes one final time. "I will tell this story differently than I intended to," he said quietly. "Not as a demonstration of your weakness, as a warning to anyone foolish enough to walk a human's road to its end." He didn't wait for a response. The officers guided him through the hatch, his remaining crew following in silence, none of them looking back. Illyra watched them go, then turned to me, some of the color returning to her face now that the immediate danger had fully passed. "He'll tell it as a warning," she said, "but it'll spread as something else by the time it reaches the outer routes. It always does." "What do you mean?" "I mean that stories like this don't stay accurate for long. By the time it's told 3 systems away, it won't be about patience or roads or 4 careful words. It'll just be about humans, and what happens if you push one too far. The nuance gets lost. Only the fear survives the trip." I considered that, and found I didn't have a comfortable answer for it. That's not really what I want people to take from this. "I don't think it matters what you want them to take from it," she said gently. "Stories belong to whoever repeats them, not to whoever lived them first." Priya joined us again, tablet in hand, already documenting the incident with the brisk efficiency of someone who had a long night of paperwork ahead, regardless of how the encounter itself had resolved. "I'll need both your statements within the hour," she said. "Standard procedure, even for incidents that end as cleanly as this one did. And Derek, for the record, I'm glad you didn't wait for the diplomatic clearance." "I almost did. What stopped you?" I looked back toward the cargo bay, now empty except for the crates and the amber standby lighting, the space already settling back into ordinary stillness, as though nothing had happened there at all. "Running out of patience," I said. "It turns out that's faster than any clearance process." Priya allowed herself a small, tired smile at that, the first real expression of relief I'd seen from her since the whole situation began. "Let's hope it doesn't have to be faster than that again anytime soon." I hoped the same thing, though some quiet part of me, the part that had just walked an entire unseen road to its very end, already suspected that hope and certainty were 2 very different things, and that whatever reputation had just been built in this cargo bay wasn't likely to stay contained to a single station for very long. I helped Illyra steady herself one final time, and together we walked out of berth 11, leaving Vask's quiet ruin behind us, carrying with me a strange, settled exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical effort, and everything to do with finally, after months of careful patience, reaching the end of a road I hadn't known the length of until I'd already walked it. News travels strangely on a station this size. It moves faster than any official channel can contain it, and it changes shape with every retelling, picking up details that were never there and losing details that mattered. By the time I returned to my quarters that evening, after giving my statement to Priya and confirming once more that Elira had been cleared by the station's medical staff, the story of Berth 11 had already made 3 full circuits of the crew decks. I learned this the next morning, when I walked into the mess hall and the entire room went quiet for a half-second before conversation resumed at a noticeably lower volume. Oss found me at my usual table before I'd even sat down properly. He didn't sit across from me the way Elira had, weeks earlier. He stood a respectful distance away, ear stalks raised in an expression I'd come to recognize as cautious curiosity. "Is it true," he said, "that you disabled 3 Corvith crew members in under 10 seconds, using only 4 words and your hands? That's a generous summary." "Generous toward you or away from you?" "Away from me, mostly. It wasn't as clean as that makes it sound." Finn arrived a moment later, setting his tray down with more care than usual, as though the table itself had become something fragile. "Tech told us what he saw," he said. "He says you walked into that hatch the same way you walked into Bay 4. No hurry, no panic, and that something about your voice when you spoke to Vask made his own translator hesitate before rendering it, like the device itself wasn't certain how to categorize the tone. Translators don't hesitate. Tech insists this one did. I didn't have an answer for that, mostly because I hadn't been paying attention to my translator status in that moment, focused entirely on Elira and the 2 crew members holding her. I ate in silence for a while, aware of the occasional glance from other tables, aware that whatever had happened in Berth 11 had already outgrown the actual event and become something closer to a fixture of station conversation. Elira joined us partway through the meal, looking more composed than I'd expected given everything from the previous day, though I noticed she chose the seat closest to the wall, a small adjustment in habit that I suspected would linger for a while yet. "The administrator wants to see you," she said, sitting down. "Both of us, actually. Something about formalizing an incident report and addressing the diplomatic fallout with the Corvith authorities." "How bad is the fallout?" "Less bad than you'd think. Vask's own clan isn't exactly eager to defend a son who got caught smuggling restricted components and then escalated to taking a station employee hostage over wounded pride. From what I've heard through cargo channels, his family is treating this as an embarrassment they'd rather bury quietly than amplify by making demands on your behalf. So no retaliation. No formal retaliation. Informal opinion is a different matter, but that was already shifting before yesterday, given what he tried to smuggle in the first place." Finn, listening with the particular intensity of someone gathering data for later analysis, leaned forward slightly. "What I want to understand," he said, "is the 4 words themselves. Tech wouldn't repeat them exactly. He said it felt wrong to say them out loud, like repeating them might somehow invoke whatever they invoked in that bay. I felt something close to amusement at that, the first lighter feeling I'd had since the previous day's tension had finally released. "They're not magic words, Finn. They're just words." "Then say them." The table went quiet. Oss had gone very still beside Finn, and even Elira, who had actually been present when I'd said them, seemed to lean in slightly, as though hearing them again in this calmer setting might reveal something the original moment hadn't allowed her to fully process. "Now I'm actually getting annoyed," I said. Nothing happened, of course. The mess hall continued its ordinary murmur around us. Nobody flinched. No alarms sounded. No Corveth crew members went pale and stepped backward. It was, in this context, simply a sentence. 4 plain words carrying no weight beyond their literal meaning. And yet Oss's earstalks had flattened slightly at the sound of them. An involuntary reaction he seemed to notice a half-second after it happened, straightening them again with visible effort. "See," I said, "just words." "That's not what just happened to my earstalks," Oss said. "That's because you already know the story attached to them now. The words themselves never had any power. It's the road behind them that matters. Without 2 hours, or 2 weeks, or however long it takes for one specific situation, the words are nothing. Say them to someone with no context, and they'll just think you're announcing a minor inconvenience." But you weren't announcing a minor inconvenience. No, I wasn't. Lyra had been quiet through this exchange, watching me with an expression I was starting to associate specifically with her, somewhere between scientific curiosity and something gentler that I hadn't entirely worked out how to name. I keep thinking about something you said in the bay, she said. About the words being the last marker before the end of the road, not the thread itself. I don't think I understood that distinction until I actually lived through it. Most people don't, until they do. Is that comforting or terrifying? I genuinely can't decide. Probably both. I think it's supposed to be both. We finished the meal with lighter conversation, though I noticed the lightness had a careful quality to it now, the kind of ease that exists alongside a fresh awareness of how quickly things could shift if circumstances demanded it. Oss and Finn left first, still debating between themselves whether the phrase carried inherent menace or whether menace was something that had to be earned through context, an argument I suspected would continue without resolution for some time. "Thank you," she said. Finally, the words simple and direct, in a way that cut through everything else that had been said over the meal. For coming through that hatch before clearance arrived. I know that wasn't an easy call to make. It wasn't really a choice by that point. The choice had already been made somewhere earlier, without me really noticing it happening. Somewhere on the road. Somewhere on the road, I agreed. She studied me for a moment, something settling in her expression that looked like the end of a question she'd been carrying since our very first conversation weeks ago. "I think I finally understand what you meant," she said, "about not knowing where the limit is until you're standing right next to it. And now I know exactly where yours was, and I hope, for both our sakes, that nobody ever makes you walk that far again." I appreciated the sentiment, though some part of me already suspected, with the quiet certainty of someone who had just learned something fundamental about themselves, that the road would always be there waiting, regardless of how much either of us hoped otherwise. Patience wasn't something I'd run out of by accident. It was something I'd spend deliberately, every single time, for exactly as long as the situation allowed, and not one moment longer than it required. The administrators' meeting that afternoon was brief and largely procedural, confirming the incident report, formally closing the manifest investigation against Vask's now departed delegation, and noting for the record that no disciplinary action would be taken against either Illyra or myself, given the circumstances. The administrator, an older Valant named Corin, who had run this station longer than most of the current crew had been alive, studied me for a long moment after the formalities concluded. "You handled that situation in a way that could have gone very differently," she said. "I want you to understand that I'm grateful it didn't, and I'm also aware that gratitude doesn't fully address the discomfort some of your colleagues are clearly feeling right now. I'm aware of that too." "Good. Then I'll ask you directly, because I think you deserve the chance to answer plainly, rather than have the question asked behind your back for the next several months. Is what happened in that bay something we should be worried might happen again, under less justified circumstances?" I considered the question with the same seriousness I'd given Illyra's questions over the preceding weeks, because it deserved exactly that level of care. "No," I said. "What happened in that bay only happened because every other option had already been exhausted, and because someone I cared about was in immediate danger with no other path to safety available. That's not a low bar. It's an extremely high one. I don't expect to reach it again, and I'd genuinely prefer not to." Corin nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with the answer, or at least satisfied enough to let the matter rest. "I believe you," she said. "For what it's worth, I've worked with a number of your species over the years, in various capacities, and I've noticed the same pattern each time. Tremendous patience, right up until the exact moment it isn't there anymore. I used to think it was a flaw in your design. I'm starting to think it might be the opposite." "How do you mean?" "A species that reacts to everything immediately burns out quickly, becomes predictable, becomes easy to manipulate by anyone who learns the trigger points. A species that absorbs almost everything, conserving its reaction for only the moments that genuinely require it, becomes something much harder to read, much harder to provoke deliberately, and much more dangerous when finally provoked correctly." She paused. Whether that's a virtue or a liability probably depends entirely on which side of the equation you happen to be standing on. I left that meeting turning her words over for the rest of the day, recognizing in them something I'd never quite articulated to myself before, despite having lived inside that pattern my entire life, without examining it closely. The patience wasn't passivity, it had never been passivity, it was simply a different kind of vigilance, one that watched and absorbed and calculated, quietly, until calculation gave way to certainty, and certainty gave way to action. I didn't know yet how widely the story of Berth 11 would travel, or how distorted it would become by the time it reached crews and stations I'd never visit. I only knew that something had shifted, both in how my crewmates looked at me and in how I understood myself, and that whatever shifted couldn't easily be put back to where it had been before. 6 months later, a different alarm pulled me out of a maintenance report, and this one actually meant what it sounded like it meant. A pirate vessel had dropped out of slip space too close to the station's outer perimeter, weapons hot, demanding docking rights under threat of opening fire on civilian traffic if refused. Station security scrambled immediately, and I found myself standing on the bridge deck observation gallery alongside Priya, watching the tactical display update in real time as the situation unfolded. "They're bluffing," Priya said, studying the readout. "Their weapon systems are old, outdated. They couldn't punch through our shields even if they actually fired, but they're betting we won't call that bluff fast enough to avoid panic among the civilian ships in transit. How long until station defense can respond properly?" 8 minutes, maybe 10. Long enough for them to do real damage if they decide to test us before we're ready. I felt that old familiar stillness begin gathering in my chest, quieter this time, more measured, recognizable now in a way it hadn't been 6 months earlier. I'd learned its shape since then. I knew roughly how much road I had before it became something else entirely, and I knew, standing here, that this situation hadn't come close to that point yet. What surprised me wasn't my own reaction, it was everyone else's. "They're requesting a channel," one of the comm officers called out. "Audio only, station-wide broadcast," apparently meant as some kind of intimidation tactic aimed at the civilian ships in the area. "Patch it through," Priya said. The pirate captain's voice crackled over the speakers, rough and confident, listing demands and threats with the practiced cadence of someone who had done this before, successfully, against stations less prepared than this one. He named a price for safe passage. He named a deadline. He made it clear what would happen to the civilian convoy currently transiting the outer lanes if either wasn't met. And then, almost as an afterthought, he made a mistake. "And don't think your station's reputation scares us," he said, voice carrying easily across every channel in range. "We've heard the stories about your human crew. Some incident months back, some dramatic standoff turned into legend by people with nothing better to do than repeat campfire tales. We're not impressed by folklore." The bridge went very quiet. I hadn't said anything. I hadn't moved. But I noticed Priya glance toward me, just briefly, and I noticed 2 other officers do the same, an instinctive check-in that hadn't existed before Berth 11, before the story had traveled however far it had traveled in 6 months, across however many retellings. "Should we patch you through to respond?" Priya asked quietly, not quite a request, more an offer she was extending because she suspected, correctly, that I might want it. I considered it for a moment. Then I shook my head. "Not yet. He hasn't actually done anything yet. Words aren't worth the road." Priya nodded, accepting that, and turned back to the tactical display, continuing the standard defensive coordination while the pirate captain's deadline ticked steadily downward on the corner display. It was Tech who broke the tension. Several minutes later, arriving on the observation gallery with a tray of supplies for the bridge crew, pausing when he saw me standing near the railing. He'd grown more confident over the past 6 months, less prone to the wide-eyed nervousness that had characterized him during the Berth 11 incident, though something in his manner still carried the memory of that day whenever situations like this arose. "Are you going to talk to him?" he asked quietly. "The pirate captain." "Not unless he gives me a reason to. He insulted the station, called the story folklore. It's not really an insult to call something folklore, Tech. Folklore is just a story that's outlived the people who first told it accurately." But it bothers you, the way he said it. I thought about that honestly before answering. A little, I admitted. Not because he doubts the story, because he's about to find out the hard way that doubting it was the wrong call, and people who haven't done anything wrong yet are going to be frightened in the meantime because of his decision to test that doubt. Tech absorbed that, nodding slowly, then glanced toward the tactical display, where the civilian convoy's transit icons blinked steadily, vulnerable and exposed in the outer lane. What happens if he does fire? Even just a warning shot, to prove his point? Then we respond appropriately, and station defense handles it the way it's designed to handle exactly this kind of situation. That's not folklore, that's just procedure. And if procedure isn't fast enough? I didn't answer that one immediately, because the honest answer was something I'd rather not need to demonstrate twice in one career, regardless of how cleanly the first time had ultimately resolved. The deadline arrived 4 minutes later, and the pirate vessel, true to the captain's earlier bravado, fired a single warning shot across the bow of the nearest civilian transport, close enough to register as a genuine threat rather than empty posturing, far enough to avoid actual contact, a calculated demonstration meant to prove the threats weren't hollow. It was also, as Priya had predicted, well within the response window station defense had been preparing for. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way Berth 11 had been dramatic. There was no quiet hatch, no 4 careful words, no single moment of contained pressure finally finding release. Instead, there was the steady, practiced response of a station defense network operating exactly as designed, intercepting the pirate vessel's weapons fire before it could repeat itself, locking onto their engines with a precision that left no room for negotiation, and disabling their ability to threaten anyone further within the space of 90 seconds. The pirate captain's voice returned to the open channel sometime after, noticeably less confident, requesting terms for surrender rather than dictating demands. I watched the resolution unfold from the observation gallery, feeling something I hadn't quite expected to feel, a kind of quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal involvement and everything to do with watching a system work correctly, absorbing a threat through patient, practiced procedure, rather than requiring anyone to walk their own private road to its end. No folklore needed, Priya said beside me, allowing herself a small, tired smile as the tactical display confirmed the pirate vessel's weapons were fully offline. Sometimes the boring answer is the right one. Most of the time, honestly. Disappointed? Not even slightly. The aftermath took most of the remaining day to process. Statements and reports, and the usual procedural cleanup that followed any incident, however cleanly resolved. By evening, I found myself back in the mess hall, more tired than I'd expected given how little of the actual resolution had required anything from me directly, sharing a quiet meal with Alira, who had spent the day coordinating with the civilian convoy to confirm no lasting damage had occurred. "I heard what he said," she said, sliding into the seat across from me, the same seat she'd chosen during our very first conversation all those months ago, about folklore. It's not wrong, technically. Stories do become folklore eventually. It's wrong in the way that matters, though. He thought folklore meant exaggeration, something that grew bigger than the truth with each retelling. She studied me for a moment. I've heard at least 6 different versions of the Berth 11 story by now, from people who weren't there, who heard it from people who weren't there either. Half of them get basic details wrong. But none of them undersell what actually happened. If anything, most of them undersell it. That's strange. It's not strange, it's just rare. Most stories grow because people want them more dramatic than reality. This one doesn't need to grow. Reality already set the bar higher than most exaggeration would dare to climb. I considered that while finishing my meal, watching the ordinary rhythm of the mess hall continue around us, crew members from a dozen species sharing tables, sharing conversation, going about the unremarkable business of a station that had, despite everything, settled back into its usual stable orbit of routine. A new face caught my attention near the entrance. A young human recruit I didn't recognize, recently transferred based on the unfamiliar insignia on her uniform, standing somewhat uncertainly as she scanned the room for an open seat, Oz spotted her at roughly the same moment, waving her over to the table where he and Finn had settled with their own meals. I couldn't hear the full conversation from where I sat, but I caught fragments of it carrying across the mess hall's ambient noise, Oz's voice rising with the particular enthusiasm he reserved for retelling station history to anyone new enough to not have heard it yet. And then he just said 4 words, Oz was saying, gesturing animatedly with one hand, while earstalks bobbed with the rhythm of his own storytelling. Just 4, calm as anything, and I swear to you, the whole room changed before he even— The new recruit's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine curiosity. What were the 4 words? Oz opened his mouth, then closed it again, glancing instinctively toward my table, the same instinctive check-in Priya had shown earlier that day, the same habit that had quietly become part of how this crew processed anything related to that particular incident. I'm not saying them, Oz said instead, lowering his voice slightly, though not quite enough to keep it from carrying. Not here, not casually. Some things you don't repeat just for the sake of a good story. Why not? Finn answered that one, his tone carrying the particular gravity he usually reserved for genuine engineering hazards rather than mere conversation. Because words like that aren't meant to be said lightly, he said. They're meant to be earned, through patience, through restraint, through every quiet moment that came before them. Say them without that weight behind them, and they're just words. Say them with it, and you'll understand exactly why nobody at this table wants to repeat them just to satisfy curiosity. The recruit looked between them, clearly intrigued, clearly still missing the deeper context that the rest of us now carried as quiet, shared knowledge. That's a strange way to talk about 4 words, she said. Now I'm even more curious what they actually are. You'll learn them eventually, Oz said. Everyone on this station does, sooner or later. But I'd rather you learn them the way the rest of us did, through the story, through understanding what came before them, rather than just hearing them said out loud with no context attached. Context is the only thing that gives them any weight at all, joined quote. The recruit accepted that, somewhat reluctantly, and the conversation drifted toward other topics, the way conversations do, leaving the specific phrase unspoken at that table for the moment, preserved as something closer to ritual than simple vocabulary. Alira, watching the same exchange from our table, turned back to me with a faint, knowing expression. They've turned you into a kind of myth, she said. Did you know that? I'd noticed something like it happening, yes. Does it bother you? I thought about the question carefully, the way I'd learned to think about most things over these past 6 months, weighing it against everything that had happened since that first quiet alarm in Bay 4, all those months ago, when Oz and Finn had first looked at me like I'd grown a second head simply for walking calmly into an emergency. No, I said finally. I think it's actually a good thing, in its own strange way. If the story keeps people patient with each other a little longer, keeps them looking for solutions before reaching for escalation, then it's doing something useful, regardless of how distorted the details get along the way. And if it doesn't, if someone hears it and decides to test the legend themselves, the way Vask did. I looked across the mess hall, at Oz and Finn and the new recruit, at the dozen other tables filled with crew members from species I'd learned to work alongside, defend, and occasionally save over these past months. At the ordinary, unremarkable rhythm of a station that had weathered both quiet patience and sudden danger in roughly equal measure since I'd arrived. Then I suppose we'll find out together, I said, exactly how long that particular road turns out to be. Illyra didn't answer right away, but she didn't need to. We sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, listening to the murmur of conversation drifting from table to table, watching the new recruit absorb her first real lesson about the crew she'd just joined, a lesson that had nothing to do with technical procedure or station regulations and everything to do with understanding exactly how much weight could live inside 4 quiet, ordinary words, waiting patiently for the day they might finally need to be spoken again. Outside the viewport, the station continued its slow, steady orbit, untroubled for now, carrying within its corridors a story that would keep traveling long after everyone who actually lived it had moved on to other postings, other crews, other quiet alarms that would, sooner or later, demand exactly the same patient, careful attention all over again. I finished my meal, said goodnight to Alira, and walked back toward my quarters through corridors that felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely and reassuringly ordinary. I didn't make it all the way there before someone called my name. It was the new recruit, the one Oss and Finn had been talking to, jogging slightly to catch up with me near the junction outside the lower observation deck. Up close, she looked younger than I'd guessed from across the mess hall, her uniform still creased with the particular stiffness of something recently issued rather than worn in. "Sorry," she said, slightly out of breath. "I wasn't sure if I should bother you. I'm Danny. I just transferred in from the Calder Reach patrol routes." Something in that name settled into place quietly, the way a piece finally fits after you've been holding it the wrong direction for a while. "Calder Reach," I repeated. "That's a name I've heard before, in a different context. The Raider story." She said it plainly, without the careful weight Oss and Finn had given it back at their table. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you. I grew up near that route. My older brother served on a transport ship out that way, years back. He used to tell us about a captain he served under, before I was old enough to understand what half the story even meant." I felt the corridor around us go very quiet, though nothing had actually changed except my own attention narrowing onto her next words. "He said the captain never raised her voice," Danny continued. "Not once, through the entire encounter with the Raiders. 2 hours of threats, and she just absorbed all of it without a single reaction anyone could read. And then she said something short, and the way he described it, his own voice still changes when he tells it, even now. He said it wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, not in the way you'd expect anger to sound. It was just final, like something had already been decided long before the words came out. Do you know what she said? He told me, eventually, once I was old enough." Danny looked at me carefully now, something assessing in her expression that reminded me, briefly and strangely, of Alira during our very first conversation in the mess hall, all those months ago. "It wasn't the same 4 words you said in Berth 11. Different captain, different moment, different exact phrasing, but it carried the same shape, somehow, the same weight underneath it. He said once you've heard it spoken for real, you recognize the shape of it instantly in anyone else who reaches that same place, no matter what specific words they happen to choose when they get there." That's an interesting way to think about it. He always said it wasn't really about the words, it was about reaching the end of however much a person was willing to carry without complaint. The words were just whatever happened to be sitting closest to the surface in that exact moment. She paused. "Is that how it felt for you, in Berth 11? I thought about the question for a long moment, turning it over with the same care I'd given every other question this crew had asked me since that first quiet alarm in Bay 4. "Yes," I said finally. "That's exactly how it felt." Danny nodded slowly, as though something she'd carried secondhand for years had just been quietly confirmed by someone who'd lived a version of it firsthand. "I transferred here partly because of that story," she admitted. "Not the official posting reasons. The real reason, I wanted to understand it properly, instead of just hearing it as something my brother brought home from a route I never traveled myself. And now that you're here? Now I think I understand a little better why nobody at that table wanted to just say the words out loud for a stranger." She smiled, small and a little rueful. "Context really is the only thing that gives them any weight. Without it, they're nothing. With it, apparently, they're enough to end a hostage situation in under 10 seconds. Something like that." We stood together at the junction for a moment longer, the station's ordinary hum continuing around us, distant footsteps and distant conversation carrying faintly down adjoining corridors. I found myself, unexpectedly, glad she'd stopped me, glad to have heard a version of this story that predated my own entirely, proof that whatever had happened in Berth 11 wasn't an isolated event, but simply the latest instance of something older, something that traveled quietly through every crew that had ever counted a patient species among its ranks. "Welcome aboard, Danny," I said. "I hope you never need to see the shape of it again, secondhand or otherwise." "Same to you," she said, and meant it, the way someone means something only after they've finally understood exactly what they were wishing for. I continued toward my quarters alone after that, the corridor stretching ahead quiet and familiar, and found myself thinking, not for the first time, that patience was never really about waiting for nothing to happen. It was about choosing, deliberately and carefully, exactly when something finally would.